very nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. And I should just warn people, there are quite a lot of my former students in the audience. And I just want to remind you that when I teach, I like to call on people. And so those of you whom I know, and I see you there, Robert, there's no hiding. I have a variety of questions, so I may call on you and ask you what you think about certain things. But first, let me just say that, as Carl said, you know, I spend a lot of time now at MIT thinking about how we can be better connected and make better contributions to the innovation community, the innovation economy, both in Boston and Cambridge, but also around the world. And one of the things that we've started to take really seriously is this sort of very clear stakeholder perspective. And I think it's often very easy to think about these innovation economies as really being sort of grounded in, you know, the absolutely central role of entrepreneurs, and there's no getting away from it. You know, entrepreneurs are exceedingly important in this whole thing. And if you said, well, who comes next, then it's probably, at least in many of the narratives around here, we say the universities, and MIT would certainly take a very, you know, a somewhat self-serving narrative and say, we've been quite instrumental in how we think about the ecosystem, and if you went to the West Coast, Stanford would surely do exactly the same. And similarly, risk capital would be the third key stakeholder. There are two other stakeholders that we tend to put at the bottom of our diagram, and they're not on the bottom because they don't matter, but rather I think they're actually sort of critically foundational. And one is obviously sort of the government and policymakers, and I do think there's sometimes a tension in how we speak about this, where we sort of think, oh, government needs to get out of the way, but in actual fact, a very proactive kind of government role at many levels is critically important. But the other sort of key pillar at the bottom of this sort of five stakeholder kind of view is really the role of large corporates. So when Carlos asked me to do this panel, you know, I said I very much wanted to do this because I do think that large corporations are often somewhat overlooked in these rather heroic narratives of ecosystems. And so I do see them, in fact, not as the entrepreneurs who are sometimes the unsung heroes. They are now, I think, sort of front and center for all of us, but it's really the large corporations that I think perhaps we sometimes forget about. So in terms of who we have here to help us think about that, obviously we have an organization like Microsoft who we would sort of think very obviously as being one of the large corporates that has played a key role since it moved into Kendall Square. But I think having Verizon help us think about that, and then MIT in terms of less as it's sort of just its knowledge production, but Lita, who spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about the interface between the university entrepreneurs and large corporations. And so our purpose, and then Jayson, who's had sort of both experiences, I think, both in large corporations, helping them kind of play more active roles in ecosystems, and again, as sort of a broker of how we kind of build the social fabric that allows all five of these stakeholders to really come together in important ways. And so I think the purpose of our panel, as I see it, is to really think about some of the novel ways in which large companies can really engage in these regional innovation economies, and sort of what are the kinds of ways that corporations can play this much more substantial role, I think, in really creating this more inclusive sense of an innovation economy. I think if we go back a little bit and we rewind the clock kind of intellectually to the sort of like quarter clusters and so on model, we actually think about large corporations as basically being both anchor tenants. So we like them from the point of view that we want to attract them, we want to give them tax breaks, they provide jobs. They're also obviously sources of very sophisticated demand in our economy, and those are, I think, really important things. But in my view and my experience, at least even in Kendall Square, when I look out my office window, you know, as we think about the role that larger corporations are playing in this much richer tapestry, it has everything to do with spaces, you know, some of the Microsoft space, the convening activities and events. And so I think really starting to understand how to do that right, and also what makes that actually quite difficult, because I think it's easy to be skeptical of large companies coming in and wanting to tap into, quote unquote, the ecosystem. It's something that makes a lot of people nervous, although they sort of want it and don't want it at the same time. And so that's really, I think, our agenda for today. So what I wanted to do is actually start by just asking each of the panelists to just take a couple of minutes to sort of describe how your own organization engages, particularly with this ecosystem. And I know that's a pretty tall ask, especially for companies that are so deeply engaged. But a few things about what you do, or perhaps one particular initiative that you've either engaged in or that you've observed, so those of you who are not sort of from quite the same large corporate perspective, that you think begins to help us exemplify this new conception of the role of the large corporation. So why don't we start over here?
Hi everyone, hope you're having a great day. Verizon has one of two innovation centers here on the East Coast in Waltham, Massachusetts, and the other in San Francisco. One of the ways in which we choose to engage with startups and entrepreneurs is to reach out through our innovation centers to talk about, the world of mobility. There probably isn't any entrepreneur that isn't thinking about that in some shape or form with their particular app, software, product, or service. So one of the ways we've chosen to engage right here in Massachusetts with this ecosystem and also use it as a launch pad for other places throughout the globe is we're working right now with about 250 companies. I think close to 180 of them are in Massachusetts alone. And out of that ecosystem already, we've seen 100 companies start rolling out their products and services. Now, they had a particular interest and need. They wanted to figure out how could they work in a mobility environment. Maybe it was embedment of a chip, a capability, compatibility, resources to help them think through how to enhance their product or service. So that's just a small example, but it's a big example because it gave us the opportunity to play in a space that we're not usually viewed as playing in. And that is using our talent, our scientists, our researchers, our engineers, and using them for others, and also giving us an opportunity to work with our groups now that have become more public, like Verizon Ventures, which does some partnerships with some of the ecosystem right here in Massachusetts and throughout the globe, working with other VCs, as well as our Verizon Global Group that is, again, looking for some very interesting partnerships. And we've seen them over and over again, and I am very excited to talk about more of them in a few minutes.
Well, Auto Harvest was started in Detroit in 2010 as a nonprofit foundation when all the large companies were going bankrupt and burning the furniture. When you look at our board, Ford, GM, Chrysler, Delphi, Wissink, 3M, United Technologies, all these large companies joined the board. Johnson controls several universities, the Department of Energy. We're partnered with the Patent Office, the Army, Homeland Security, because they all were searching for a mechanism, a new mechanism that would connect them seamlessly to inventors and peers around the world, whether big or little. We created a system modeled on the automotive supply chain system called Wissink that connects people privately, so that when a member, whether it's a Verizon or two guys and a dog in Kendall Square, have an IP opportunity to buy, sell, or collaborate, they basically speed date innovation among themselves with collaboration rooms. And it makes the world a lot smaller because large companies, as vast as a GM or Verizon, frankly, are still overwhelmed with the number of technologies and needs that they have and the number of sources. So getting everybody connected in a more efficient way and letting them do their own matchmaking and speed dating and not interfering is our model. And doing it as a nonprofit foundation means we have no favorites and we have a neutral environment. That's what we help.
So I lead our civic engagement program here in Boston for Microsoft. And when I first took on the job about a year ago, one of the things that we talked about was the importance of convening the community around issues important in the civic engagement space. And, to be frank, I was a little skeptical. How important can a convening space be? As someone who has now spent a good amount of time watching what comes in and out of the conference center at One Memorial Drive in Cambridge, I can tell you that it is a very, very powerful tool in bringing together these open systems that we were talking about in the previous panel. We see startups come through, we see nonprofits, large organizations, all in the interest of facilitating that porousness, that conversation at times. And one of the things we decided to do when we started this process about a year ago was also create our own platform to connect, catalyze, and convene conversations around policy and technology issues important to the community. And so we started the Microsoft Innovation and Policy Center in New England last year. And within that, we've had conversations from a governor's forum that we held for the gubernatorial candidates last week to issues on STEM education within the Commonwealth, as well as something we're doing in conjunction with District Hall, which is called Conversations in Civic Technology. And it is something where it's really great. I'll go downstairs. My office is on the 17th floor. I'll go down to the first floor. And every day there's something different. And every day there's a different conversation going on that facilitates innovation. And it's really, we're really finding it gratifying to be able to give it to the community in that way.
I don't know where to start in terms of, I'm director of MIT's Technology Licensing Office. And the role of large corporations is intertwined with what we do in an amazing way. They, first of all, they hire a lot of our people, but they are now supporting close to 20% of MIT's $700 million a year in research, which is an enormous change. So they support research. They also bring in a knowledge to our researchers of what are the needs, how are decisions made, where are they going to go with that. But that's only the beginning. The next thing that happens is often startup companies form out of the research. Generally, the large corporations are not taking the patents and intellectual property that come out of the work they're sponsoring because the results are too early for a large corporation to accommodate. Too risky, too long a time to market. What they're looking for, though, is their own supply chains. So we get the small companies started, say it's a biotech company. As soon as it takes the platform technology to a point where it's you can see the commercial proof of concept, not just the academic proof of concept. They will likely partner with the large corporations who are then able to do their balance sheet, to do their development without needing the new specialized personnel for it, and without having to invest much cash at that moment. Then, of course, if it works, they either acquire the product or the next step for the large corporations is they have become a critically important way of venture investors liquidating investments by corporations, the large ones acquiring the small companies. Some years ago, I sat next to a guy from Cisco, and he says, "You know what you guys could do in universities for us?" I said, "No, God." He said, "Start more companies. That's where our growth comes from." And then, so it goes on and on and on that way. The interesting thing about what you talked about in cluster theory, some of which started in the other Cambridge, was the theory was that a large anchor tenant moves in, and then suppliers, small company suppliers, then move into the region. And although they didn't say it this way, every time there's a round of layoffs, you've got a lot of entrepreneurship going on while people are making their own jobs. But what's interesting in Boston is that the clusters grew upside down. There were no pharmaceutical companies in Boston. But after there were about 250 biotech companies from which the large corporation, the pharmaceutical companies saw their product pipeline coming. Look around, you'd think that this had been a center of global pharmaceutical companies for 100 years, but instead it was upside down. Same thing to some extent is happening with the Verizons, the Microsofts, the whatever. So it's an upside down cluster theory from that one.
Thank you, Lita.
But we're glad they're here.
We're happy. We really are. So I just wanted to ask, so I certainly observe a lot of large corporations that sort of come into, as you say, Lita, sort of come into Kendall Square or coming in down here all throughout this sort of innovation ecosystem. And I think, as Jayson, you've described, many companies trying to solve these problems. I wonder whether it's possible to just sort of think a little bit about, as you have tried to design and think about the modes of engagement sort of Cathy and Donna, and also Lita, what all of you have seen is whether there are some particular mistakes. So I've certainly observed mistakes that I think that large corporations have made in just sort of trying to engage because they're trying to come in and sort of figure out. And I'm just curious, and I don't need you to name names, but we don't need to name and shame anybody, but rather sort of what are the kinds of things that you think are sometimes missteps that people have taken?
This is an area I'm very passionate about. About 8 years ago, when Governor Patrick came into Massachusetts, the big focus was biotech. And many of us in the tech industry were in Carl's is laughing because he was part of this mission with us. We were a little hurt. We liked the idea of focus on something, but we felt that the tech industry was very, very strong. So we engaged others. And that wasn't a normal thing for us to do. Even large companies going with government and working together, large companies working with higher ed institutions on research about the industry versus a particular product or service. And then engagement of some of the associations that had members which contained smaller entrepreneurs and startups. So that was a good thing. So that was a great thing. We called ourselves, and we call ourselves, a Tech Hub Collaborative. And it's all volunteer, you don't get elected, and we work with the Mass Technology Leadership Council, Mass Challenge, MyTechs, you can go on and on and on. One of the things we learned early on was tech alone isn't that powerful. And tech alone isn't just people that are part of these organizations. It's very small people, small companies rather, or startups or entrepreneurs that don't have the time to spend in meeting with big groups and talking about issues, and quite honestly are just focused on getting to the next day and the next goal. So that was like a big learning for us. We had to engage in a different way, and it really reared its ugly head last year when we had something called the software tax pop. And we learned a lesson then also that tech couldn't kind of handle those kinds of big issues alone. We needed to engage with other bigger business organizations who care about overall taxation, not just the tech tax, because what that fueled was kind of a movement amongst folks that were entrepreneurs to say, hey, we need to have a voice here. We don't have the time, maybe not the energy or the interest to be part of these bona fide organizations. So for me personally, what that's taught me is we have to continue to figure out ways to reach out and engage. That's why I was delighted to be asked to be here today, quite honestly, because we found our work with Mass Challenge to be able to reach out, and all of us in some way have made investments in the Mass Challenges, and in Rhode Island we do it as well with Beta Spring and others, to just say, okay, how do we keep reaching out? But that convening and engagement, what Cathy was talking about, is so important because we want to make sure all voices are heard. Because we want a richer, growth-oriented economy here, and we know we can't do it alone.
Thank you. You see, you've done what I had to learn to do when I came to America, which is when you're asked about a mistake that somebody makes, is to say something really, really positive. And this is not a skill that we learn in England. We do the opposite. When you ask somebody about what they've done well, you normally criticize them. So I'm going to press you, Jayson, and see whether I can persuade you.
I sign confidentiality agreements.
No, I don't mean that. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I would say I'll go big way. I think there are three buckets that matter. So first is a large company's intellectual property, and I think right now that's a big hoard, whether Microsoft or Verizon, are surrounded by two hoarders probably. And don't
we try not to hoard at MIT, right?
But that's an uninformed guess. Because
And I have to say, we do not take any intellectual property from anyone at the Innovation Center, just to go on the record.
No, we want you to give out yours, make it available so that other people could start companies. That's what we did at Delphi. You see, you can't be afraid of that. So that's an open area. That's an open terrain. Okay, there's a lot of opportunity there. The second area is who do you have talking to these thousands of little companies and people? So in Detroit, often the poor guy would finally get a meeting with some engineers sitting around some table somewhere inside one of the car makers. And so what you see now are companies very proudly talking about their new innovation teams and what should be the skill sets in an innovation team, and who should we hire to be an innovation team, and so that we know how to engage people and find them and don't scare them away and figure out what to do with them. And that's really good, and that's starting to really start to happen. The third one is resources and, let's say, the business arrangement and money. And I think there's sort of a couple of things. So obviously people have never really liked dealing with Detroit if you're an innovator, because it's a product that's always commoditized, and the innovation always brought down to the lowest cost, and a lot of people that feel like they were cheated out of value. And that's a legacy a lot of people are really working very hard to overcome, particularly as tomorrow's car is not yesterday's car. And so corporate venture capital funds, right, were unheard of. Out-licensing was unheard of. Now it's becoming more common. I think the best thing that's happened overall is that the conversation's gone all the way on to the front page of the Wall Street Journal, telling board members they should be asking, what is our innovation strategy, so the CEO could turn around to his team and say, who knows what that, right? And all of a sudden, it has to be tops down. And they have to burn money. They have to waste money. They have to spend money, because good ideas are few and far between. You spend a lot of money on experiments before you get to the good one. A lot of these guys run out quickly. They get discouraged. And I think that's the new ethos that needs to be, that sort of longer term. We're going to invest in this. We have a team that knows how to deal with these people. We're going to have a lot of failures, and we're going to have a couple big wins along the way. And that's where I think it's going, slowly.
So Fiona asked if someone would really decide to go all the way and talk about a failure. Microsoft, we're professional scapegoats, so I'm happy to talk about a failure. I work for Dan Lewin, who has been very actively involved in the VC community for a long time. He sits in Silicon Valley, and one of the directives he gives all of us, and there's 5 teams that do the work that I do, and my colleague Amy Sprung does here in Boston. We're in 5 locations, and he says one of the most important things you need to be doing is staying for dinner. In terms of when you engage with the community, you're there. You show up for everything. It's not a one and done, in and out, only partially engage with the community. We saw this with some of the work we did in the Open XML days. I don't know if I want to go down too far that particular path, but for those of you who have been around know that we only showed up at times when it was important for our business, and we've learned from that. And to Jason's point around IP and stuff, I'd encourage you to go look at Microsoft Open Tech, which looks at some of the work we're doing around opening up our IP and working with the open source community. But I think that's really important, that it isn't enough to be injecting yourself into the community. You really need to be of the community. Now, it wreaks havoc with my social life, but if I look at my schedule, every week I spend a lot of time going to dinners, going to coffees, talking to people, being with events. But it's really important, because it is something where you're not going to understand the problems you're trying to address unless you really infuse yourself into that community at a given time. And the other thing I would add is, and this I think is a technology thing, and I'm not sure it's the same for Donna, but in the high-tech space, we often, rather than looking at the problems that a community is trying to address, we'll often lead with technology. We've got a hammer, so everything's nailed. And I think that's something we're starting to learn about at times. So hopefully that hit a couple good failures, and we didn't answer that.
I appreciate it. Lita?
You know better than I.
Lita, you know where the bodies are buried, I think. So on time.
Well, I'm going to generalize to the universities and the research community in general, because I think we've managed to sidestep this mistake. And that is assuming that their intellectual property is a primary source of money, of support, that they're going to get rich off. And as a result, dealing with companies, it takes forever, because it's all focused on, what if it gets big? I want to make sure I get a big enough piece. You look statistically across the country, and you take the 200 best research universities in the country, and you add up all their tech transfer revenue in a year, which includes cashing in and equity and whatever. It's a big number. It's almost $3 billion. Ha! When you divide it by their research base, it's about 5%. And it's wildly skewed. People hit the lottery and they get very rich for a while. In fact, I think it was fiscal '09, I crawled into the data when it was about $2.5 billion and discovered that half that total was accounted for by 6 universities who'd hit a big blockbuster patent and sold all their royalties and not going to be anything next year. So to see it as a source of revenue primarily, and it's not the tech transfer offices, it's the heads of the institutions who think they're going to get rich if they only find the right director. Instead, that's why it's a very high turnover business, although I've been here for 28 years, not helping. Because we don't look at it that way. We see intellectual property as a way of encouraging investment in our embryonic technology so it might become a product. And that's become more and more important as a dowry for startup companies. And sometimes we make money. We did on Akamai, by the way. And sometimes, and most times we don't. But it's not the primary purpose. So when you look at any business, you say, what's my primary mission? If you get it wrong, you get the business wrong.
So I want to pick up on this idea. So I think both Jayson, you and Lita have sort of alluded to this idea that, you know, there's sort of intellectual property is one of the assets that sort of be, if you like, put into the system, right? And it might be intellectual property, it could be particular technologies, opening things up, it could be infrastructure, sort of giving and putting things into the system. I mean, in some senses, I think of these innovation ecosystems, right, as places where everybody's contributing some amount of public goods. And so if everybody puts public goods in, lots of spillovers get created. And then we all, in our own institutions, have to take something out to justify why we, you know, are participating. One of the things that I think is quite challenging here are the sort of transaction costs and the sort of contractual apparatus that often gets put in the way. And I wonder whether or not any of you have had experiences of sort of when we start to standardize ways of engaging and modes of engagement, whether it's through standard material transfer agreements, which I think were very important in helping academia put some of their materials out into sort of the public space, whether it's sort of standardizing licensing agreements, standardizing non-disclosure, I mean, whatever it might be. I think that that's a part of a significant friction that I think particularly is a challenge for large corporations because they have so many lawyers that we sort of have to give them something to do, and so, and you know, we're not alone. I mean, MIT has plenty as well. So I just wonder whether you've seen, and especially with what you're doing in Auto Harvest, have you tried to sort of standardize some of these?
Yes. So the one thing I haven't done, my failure, is my members have said, why don't you create a standard NDA, post it, so that in one day we can meet a stranger, decide we like each other, go to the first and second date, they can download it, sign it, fax it back, we can open up a collaboration, put in some stuff, and 90% of the people will do that. 10% need something special, so it's definitely on the docket. I haven't done it, shame on me. You haven't, me, but you're a professor, you're supposed to do that. I think the other part that we've tried to do is standardize, and our system runs on some templates. And so when people submit and respond, they want to get to know each other. We ask them the same dozen questions because nobody wants a 30-page business plan. They want to know, and they, you know, I tell my members, it's great if Ford gives somebody a fast no. That's almost as good as a long-term yes. So I think the bigger problem that's part of is the cycle time, because that's a cost. But the real thing is, do you really want to wait 4 months to get people together because of their travel schedules to talk about a possibility and look at this stuff and interview? Or do you want to do it in a day? And if we can get closer to the day, people can vet and really go through the speed dating. And I think it's time, you know, the legal fees are crazy, so you want to get cost and standard documents. But I think the bigger cost is the travel and getting people now to spread out all over the world together quickly. So absolutely, everybody wants to be faster.
One of the things I would say we've learned through a lot of mistakes, and we've through the years had a lot of engagements, I think, with MIT in one way or the other. Some of them have been great, some of them have been not so great, and mostly on our part, because we are so big, and to your point, we really didn't have a focused kind of effort, so we let the attorneys, and I'm married to one, so I love them in some respects, but it's just, we've let ourselves become too bureaucratic, and that probably doesn't surprise you for a company that has 180,000 people globally throughout the world. But what we've learned now through our new product development focus is, and the innovation centers are part of that, is we've learned to standardize a little bit more. We've also learned that the cycle time for startups and entrepreneurs is important, and that our cycle time, which is a benefit to us as a corporation over a longer period of time, is not a good match. And so we have to quickly fail fast in even our relationships with folks. Whereas before, I would tell you in the past few years, 10 years, it would be a long, prolonged, painful relationship and not a good one. But I think we've learned from that, and that's really, I think, when I think about what you just said, that's been a great learning for us, an important one if we really want to play in this ecosystem.
I'll just add one little piece to that, because one of the little dirty little secrets in a lot of these companies is they have internal development versus external sourcing and advanced purchasing. And it's sort of like, who's watching the hen house? So they find a hot little company like Electricity up here from MIT for conductive charging, one of your favorites, I'm sure.
Since I never remembered.
Right. And who do they have review it? The advanced person, you have to bring to the engineering people who say, oh, we can do that better. And that delays this, and it's not transparent. And I think that's that other little layer of, and you're nodding your head, you've been through that.
I've never seen that.
There's so much here that I agree with. Back to this question around the tension around IP. Speaking as neither a lawyer nor a business development person, and I'm frequently confused with a business development person here in Boston, which I'm not, I think it goes back again to the previous panel in terms of systems theory. I mean, I think we all agree that an innovative system is an open system, and I think if you look at how large companies approach this, universities approach this, small companies approach this, it's really around that degree of openness, and what does that mean? And even thinking about open sourcing knowledge again, how much of that is open? So additionally, the agility thing, and Donna, we're only half your size. We're only 90,000 people. So, but when I think of the ability it takes to get something really simple done, and it's really frustrating because you have a local group that you're trying to do something really useful with, and you've got to run it up the flagpole with 15 different organizations. You're really matrixed, and your local contact's going, Kath, come on, get back to me with something, and they don't recognize these internal mechanisms get in the way and gum up the works. That's one of the biggest challenges.
Culture comes from the top. And when we talk about innovation and then we talk about the lawyers, there's a disconnect. I'll tell a story that's for real, but I won't name the company. A large pharmaceutical company, about 6 weeks ago, whose sponsors were various projects at MIT, the CEO met with our provost as part of a CEO panel, and it said, we're really interested in fundamental research. At this stage, the IP isn't very important to us at all. So he tells me about it. They are the company that we have the most trouble negotiating with. You can negotiate with them for 2 months in which you finally convince them these are the bright lines, it's not a negotiation. If I give on that one, I get fired, so can we stop talking about it? And we'll finally sign it. 4 weeks later, we have another project with them, and they go on the same bright lines. By the time they've done it 6 times, my staff is completely demoralized. Now, the message came from the top. If there was a connect between those 2 statements, it would just be amazing.
What I don't want to do, so I think that everything that you've all described makes a lot of sense. I think one thing I want to sort of remember, and entrepreneurs in the audience I think will agree, that quite often the intellectual property and the ideas and knowledge that early stage companies have is profoundly important to them. So these things kind of bite both directions.
I'm not saying not huge and important, or I wouldn't have a job.
I think that one of the things that we've observed, right, is the more that people both understand the standardization of some of these things and understand the logic. So I think the logic of the internal decision making, or the structure, the logic of why.
Or what each department is told its job. And maybe the new business development, you gotta be quick, but nobody told the contract people.
One of the other things I just want to raise before I think I'd like to open this up to questions from the audience and a sort of conversation and opinions is it seems to me that we've gone through a variety of phases of how we think about innovation. So for a long time within large companies we had something that I think we might have called an R&D strategy that was mostly about sort of very specifically the research and development part of the organization. And I think we then discovered, and we discovered a variety of things around portfolio management and stage gate and so on. And then we had this sort of epiphany of open innovation, which I think for a little while seemed like a really lovely thing. It was sort of went along with open source, and everything was going to be free, and it was all going to be out there. And I would argue that what we're seeing is a sort of new phase that I think is something around, it's an innovation ecosystem strategy. So the question I like the CEOs, especially the ones who have asked their organizations to make significant investments in these very expensive locations like Boston, is what's your ecosystem strategy, right? What are you going to contribute? What do you want out of it? How long is it going to take? And how much of this is sort of specific transactions with particular startups and so on, and how much of it is really sort of community engagement, and there's obviously a relationship between those two things. And who are the key actors that you need to engage with to do that? And I think that's a very different conception of what an innovation strategy is. And then I think, Jayson, to your point, that then has to be deeply connected to what's going on inside. And so even if you can get your ecosystem piece right, and I don't see very many organizations who sort of joined that up. So there's somebody who does internal corporate venturing, there's somebody else who does what I think used to be called government affairs, but I think the idea of civic is very different, and I really like that shift in language and thinking. And somebody else whose sort of job it is to go and think about small suppliers, but in fact all these jobs are deeply connected. And so the idea of the innovation team just seems to me to be a shift towards that more ecosystem thinking that's both joined up in how we engage with the place and joined up internally. And that's a very difficult thing, I think, to do. I mean, at MIT we have to do that, and I'm not sure we do that very well at all, but we certainly think about it these days in a way that we haven't, I don't think, in the past. We've had very dyadic sort of relationships with big companies and relationships with startups and relationships with the government. And so I do think that we're at an important inflection point, which I think Carl's recognised by having us talk about this. So let me open it up. There are a lot of people in this room who've got deep experience, and ask you whether you have comments or questions for the panel.
Microphone.
Do you want to run it out?
Hi, Liz Reynolds from MIT's Industrial Performance Center. We are very, as a society, as a community, we spend a lot of time talking about startups and the entrepreneurs and the startup ecosystem. But we've been looking at our center, and I think it's become more of interest to everybody around the issue of scale-up and what happens after the startup and what happens after that initial incubator and accelerator, and what do we see after the 5-year survival rates, etc. And what we know the data shows is that strategic partners are playing more and more of an important role for helping companies grow to scale. And we know this is a big problem in energy, but we see it in life sciences, we see it across a number of different industries. And we had a panel several months ago on this topic, and we had a number of entrepreneurs at the table. And on one side was the perspective that said, we absolutely need to embrace and engage as strategic partners, figure out how to make this work, understand what the bottlenecks are, because they are, in fact, the critical pathway for scale-up in this country. That capital has got hits a limit, etc., and the knowledge that comes within the strategic partners is critical. And then we had another perspective which said, absolutely don't touch them with a 10-foot pole. It's complicated. The time, life cycle, time is to kind of coincide or kind of sync up your schedules is really problematic, and you need to find other ways in which you can do this scale up, but stay away because the strategic partners actually are bring you down. They're potentially, some of them, just interested in the M&A option. And I'm interested in your perspective on how we, first of all, I would think all of you think the strategic partners are critically important to the scale-up process, but how you think we bring along the strategic partners in this process, because there's a whole wide range of how well companies engage in this, and particularly on this important issue of scale-up, which I think has implications for our region and for the country as a whole.
Well, I was going to start at the younger end, and I think it might be very useful to the older end. The city, MIT, everybody, is starting to do exceptionally well in mentoring the early stage of companies. How do you get started? How do you get your first round of capital? How do you meet the right people? But when you get to the point of strategic partnerships or potential strategic partnerships, there is none of the mentoring type help. You have to either find an expensive lawyer downtown and 3 other people, no way to say, what's the soft part of it? How do you make the connections? How do you make them work? And I think that's needed as an extension of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have, but it's also needed on the other side to start a dialogue with the large companies of what's the right way to do this, what's the most effective way, and in many ways, what's the most ethical way, so that you don't starve them to death before you say yes or no.
This at-scale issue is one of the key topics in the Mass Tech Hub Collaborative, and Colin Angle, who many of you may know, who's the head of iRobot, he and Rodney Brooks, co-founded iRobot, and there have been other robotic companies that have spawned from those. He and Muhammad Ali, who previously was with Avaya, and now the strategic M&A guy for HP in our area, along with many other entrepreneurs who made it, who grew their companies to scale, are putting their heads together with academia and with government on how to create and foster relationships. Michael Greeley from Flybridge Partners, along with a team of folks, Steve Papa, Shubai, and some others, are putting together groups of entrepreneurs with VCs, with legal people, with other academics, and trying to create these communities of support. The issue is the scale, because even in those efforts, they're trying to help folks grow and have these strategic partnerships at a very early level and then follow them along stage. It has not been easy. It's been a big, big challenge, as you have suggested. One of the things that, I'll use an example, I won't give the name of the company that we've been working with in Verizon on the strategic partnership piece, is it started off working with, the Mass Challenges type of competition. We were looking for innovation in healthcare. We had a company whose founder was the dad of a young boy who had diabetes. Put together, he was originally in jewelry manufacturing, a bracelet, and wanted to have some type of mobility to be able to convey his son's readings to the appropriate healthcare professionals. We worked with this company from the very early stages and showcased them at, for example, the Consumers Electronics Show, provided them with some philanthropic capital, engaged them with other suppliers. There does get to a point, though, if that's not going to be your core business and you just want to kind of enable, versus continue, if you will, investing, that there becomes this challenge for the startup as to what next. Now, how do I get my next round? I'm happy to say that this particular company stayed with us in whatever way we could connect them, ended up getting a contract with CVS, with Walgreens, and as a result of that, ended up getting more, investment. But that's just one example. The question is, how do you grow that? And I'll be honest with you, we're learning how to do that right now.
I just make one comment on that I think the people that figure that out are going to have their country is going to be the one that moves the needle globally, because I think that's where the biggest set of opportunities are. I just say that we were given a sole source contract from the Department of Homeland Security. I have in my bag 200 projects and technologies that Homeland Security's put $1 million into. They're all SMEs. They want to give each of those companies $3 million. Let me assure everybody in the room, you want their product to get commercialized. Just imagine who their customers are. And we're supposed to help them find those partners and work them through that process. And it is Herculean. So I think that whoever thinks, maybe you should have a course. And train. We need that next generation of managers for that.
It's a hard problem. I don't know whether you had any.
Nothing else to add, it's just hard.
It's hard. I would say actually, so I spend a lot of time in other countries talking about these issues, and although I think it's not something that we do perfectly here, in fact our ability to do that in the US is actually something that when you go outside of the US and outside of Boston is enviable to other people. And so I think although we see this as challenging, if you step into Europe, people will say mostly the argument will be why are all these American companies coming along and buying our startups and moving them to the United States? And sort of why are they better at actually undertaking these strategic partnerships and these strategic transactions? So I think that, again, my sense is that some of this is, I have a list that I've been putting together of what I call the kind of top innovation movies. So the movies that sort of talk about themes in innovation and innovation strategy and so on, and of course Social Network would be a good one to make sure that you get your early partners right. The other one that I think is one of the Detroit challenges, right, is the intermittent windshield wiper Bob Kearns movie. I can't remember the name of the movie now, but...
The poster of that movie hangs in Ford's offices, and somebody wrote on it, "It's not true." It's framed and hanging there.
Okay, because it's such a good story, it doesn't really matter anymore. I think the moral of the story, right, is about, on both sides, people actually engaging in good faith, right? And so, we go through lots of these negotiation exercises as we teach about this stuff, and it's always about understanding the interests of both sides. And so I think that, I generally believe that there's an awful lot of rationality in these systems, but that it's sort of transaction costs of the trusts are the pieces that often go wrong. And so I think bringing these communities together is actually a very important piece of that puzzle.
I guess we got Bill's next question.
Flash Genius is the movie.
Thank you. You're genius. Thank you, see. Thank you.
Fiona, I'd like to pick up on your point about the perception. There's a piece in the Boston Personality where we've had a lot of branch offices disappear. We've had a lot of headquarters get acquired. And you start to worry about that, right? Which is to your point about in an extreme case where companies get dragged overseas or whatever. But the best example that we've seen, I think, in the last 20 years is what Procter & Gamble did when they came in here and acquired Gillette. And Branch Kimball, who was in charge of economic development at the time, told Procter that you can't just come in here from Cincinnati and buy Gillette. Gillette's one of our cornerstone enterprises in Boston, and he overstated it to make the case. But to Procter's credit, what they did is their CEO and head of research came in and they said, okay, set up meetings with us with the areas where we might invest in the Massachusetts economy to balance the perspective so that we're also bringing investment into new enterprises. And they went on 100 different meetings, and they did make 10 investments. And it was a real model, I think, of how to acquire a company in Massachusetts or New England, because there was this tit-for-tat feeling of real reciprocation model. I think what's happened with Google and Microsoft and with Dassault from France and Sanofi and you know, just think of the acquisitions we've seen. Takeda's Millennium acquisition. Some of these were very large acquisitions, but they've all learned from that Proctor model. We've shoved that in front of them as they've made these acquisitions. And I would love to hear more about, you know, certainly Verizon has been an exemplary corporate citizen here. Microsoft open door policy has been fabulous, the way you guys have thrown it open at the Nerd Center. So exemplary behaviors by these companies that we should celebrate. And I don't know, Fiona, back to your point though, I do think that there's a right way and a wrong way for large companies to come and engage with a whole community, right?
So, you know, there are many people in the room who can speak to Microsoft coming into Cambridge much more eloquently than I, in part because I've been here all of a year. I came in from Seattle. But one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is our sense of place in Kendall Square and why it's important for us to be in Cambridge. We have an amazing amount of technology talent that comes out of places like MIT, that comes out of Northeastern, comes out of a number of places. And we recognize that there's a quality of life here that we want to make sure people can both work for us and live in the place they want to live. I think it speaks volumes that in terms of, we've watched in the recent layoffs that we've had, Cambridge was really unaffected. And it is something where they say some very important R&D location for us to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we can continue to contribute to the innovation economy by having the open door policy that we've had at NERD since 2007. But yeah, I think it boils down to people matter. And people don't necessarily want to pick up and move to the Pacific Northwest and get rained on 9 months out of the year. And we want to make sure that they have a place where they can innovate and contribute both to the economy and to our business.
I mean, if I could just sort of pick up one point. So I do think we probably want to make a little bit of a distinction between sort of large corporations that come in and make big acquisitions, right? So you're buying a really big sort of existing company. And again, I've seen this in a number of countries, and companies make commitments. I mean, Hershey's in their acquisition in the UK, they made commitments to what they would keep, which they did, right? I mean, they basically make a commitment and then they walk away from it. And you can understand why that's true. I think that most large organizations and small recognize that if you do come into a place, and you come into a place like Boston, these are very small communities, right? I mean, how many of us know each in this room have walked in and don't know one another, or we're all probably less than 3 degrees of separation, right? This is, our innovation economy is actually a small thing. It's a tremendous thing, a real engine of the state, but I think it's actually tremendous, the sort of social structure that we have among us. And so I think some of that social structure and the connectedness is what actually leads to this good behavior, because you know that you're coming in, actually this is what you want to be part of this community. So I think that that's something that probably sort of creates its own rather nice enforcement mechanism, if you like. One of the things that I see is that especially for foreign, for some of the foreign companies who come in, they don't know the culture, they don't know the community. There's a very interesting question about who are the brokers, who helps you navigate your way through the system. And I think that places like District Hall are sort of important, it's an important place. It's a physical convening space, but it's also sort of part of this brokering of the community. And so I think CIC does some of that, and we do some of that at MIT. I think Microsoft, I actually see more of my MIT colleagues when I go for the free Diet Coke in the Microsoft Nerd Center. Infinite supply of Diet Coke, and it just turns out that really helps. I think that this can actually be confusing for people. I think, and that's a good thing that we have such a rich ecosystem that it can be a little confusing, but I think how one makes sure that if we introduce new people effectively into this social fabric, I think is a really important and quite challenging thing. And I think that's why Tim and Kevin, and others, we're all trying to do this, right, in different ways.
What would be a way, when you're talking like that, there seems to be a role for going. It shouldn't just depend on good hosts. You would think that there would be some kind of a concierge service for having people meet each other.
Well, I suspect that if Rich Elam was here from Moiti, he would probably be part of that. I think I have made a nice opening here to say something, I'm sure. I also think that here, some of the consumer core who I deal with on a fairly regular basis kind of help the best ones of them help their foreign companies come in and really become braided into the community in a really neat way.
I think you said it really well, and I would just add, I think even the best of the best of the consular presences do more than that. If you think of, I think particularly the Swiss and the British consulates have convened the whole community in it very actively. So lots of people in the Boston community probably first met at the Swiss consulate. They met each other, right? Or at one of the events at the beautiful British consulate.
That's because they're in our building.
Exactly.
And, yours and mine, and they have good drinks.
So Greg Banelecki and I who's Secretary of Economic Development, I have had a number of conversations about this. And Richard O'Lellman, his predecessors at Moiti. Our government definitely plays a role, and also City of Cambridge, City of Boston. I don't know if Dan Coe's still around, but have played a role. I think that there is this sort of potpourri of folks, and a whole bunch of them are on the panel today, and there are probably 20 others of us, and I feel like we're playing, I don't know what hacky sack or something. We're bouncing the ball back and forth between each other. Constantly, continuously, and I mean, I must send emails to all of you. I mean, Lita, I sent you an email just last week. What do we do with this startup technology, or how does this person license this thing? And I think a measure of how effective an innovation ecosystem is really a measure about how fluid those connections can be. So that if you're going to randomly start with any one of us, just because that's who you know first, or someone introduces you to. And then if we're effective as an innovation ecosystem, there's enough trust that, first of all, I'm not going to send you something that's a waste of your time. And second of all, when I do send you something, you'll quickly sort of ping it on, and very quickly that proper connection gets made. I think of this as, you could think of it as a measure of conductivity of metal. If we are a metal, are we highly conductive or lightly conductive? And what can we do to increase the conductivity of the metal of which we are made?
That's a good techie MIT thing. The expression I would use for this, so I'm happy that I'm glad as a British person that my consulate is doing a good job. Actually, it's from that sort of world that I think about this idea that we all in this system act as this sort of as innovation diplomats, right? There's a sort of innovation diplomacy that I think we all engage in terms of both connecting into this fabric and then bringing outsiders in, and especially people from abroad. And I think that that's a very important piece. And I do think you're right, that each of us, people randomly bump into one of us, and there are many of you in this room who would be in exactly the same role. And it is the way it gets sort of put through the system. I do think the other thing that we're all doing is spending time understanding ourselves, so we become a little more self-reflective, so that we do understand some of the connections, and that makes it easier to explain to other people. Because it is a complex sort of tapestry that we're kind of engaged in. I don't know, is that something that does that sound familiar from a Detroit point of view? Is that something new? Does it feel the same as you hear us describe things here?
I think it's universal. Some people have, bigger communities. And, we spawned a lot of the venture capital community when the earlier speakers talked about getting at the money. We were the first state to let the pension fund put 1% alternative investments, and that attracted a lot of venture capital people. We do that. There's a whole network of people that have been around. In a way, it's a bit too incestuous, frankly, and sometimes the pond needs a change of water. So I think that's the one disadvantage to that. But I think my whole approach has been to make it virtual so it goes global, and you have all these connections and friends around the world that are valuable that you would never meet, and that's different. I think that's the way it goes. I think you got to get to that next step. That's what Carlos talked about earlier. That's why I came here, to connect. The innovation districts need to be connected, and you have to do that electronically, and that's what we're trying to figure out. But Detroit's a small town for sure that way.
Hi, I'm Livia Brockman, and I'm here from the Heartland. So I'm sort of drooling when I hear a lot of this discussion. I'm in Ohio, and so we deal with many of these older industrial cities, legacy cities. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is, and I think we'll be talking about this a little more tomorrow, but just how would you think about replicating this incredibly rich ecosystem that exists in the Boston area in places that aren't even Detroit, meaning aren't even as, haven't fallen as far as Detroit, but also don't have the critical mass that Detroit does. And this isn't a question that I'm just contemplating, but many people throughout places in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where there are pretty good anchor institutions, and they may have their own niche, but you just don't have that richness that's here or even in Detroit. And I am intrigued by the virtual system that you've set up in Detroit, because it seems to me that that can work at some level, but that much of this still does need to be very place-based, particularly when you're dealing with, developing a critical mass, in multiple places. So I just want to throw that out. I don't have an answer. I just thought I'd throw that out to discuss further.
Who wants to answer?
Start with 50 years.
It's funny when you were talking about the heartland, even in Massachusetts, we struggle with how do we replicate the cool stuff, the great work that's happening within Route 128, which is kind of our tech belt, with Western Massachusetts and the Berkshires, with Cape Cod, with other areas, even within the city of Boston. I think Tim would tell you the question from the mayor is, how do we get out into the neighborhoods and create this culture? And it's one, frankly, that we're struggling with. One, because you need some ideal conditions. You need the people. You need some anchors there. And so I think one of the really exciting things in Massachusetts, in a little place called Holyoke, if you're from out there, we don't say Holyoke, we say Holyoke. But the computing center, the high performance computing center, it brought universities, I think, can do a lot in areas where you don't maybe have the massive industry. It drew in partnerships with industry from Cisco, from EMC, IBM, and others, and also brought in government. And I think that in areas that are not as easily investable, if you will, there has to be that combination.
I would just say, fund your journeymen who leave the, a lot of Ohio State's on our board, and we work with Polymer Ohio and all sorts of groups that, when they come to other areas, they're bringing that back, and then find that one special thing you have that draws people to you, and I think that's just how it goes.
I mean, my answer, I think, is pretty much the same as Lita's, right? Which is, if we were sitting here, if you rewound the clock to what sort of, when did, so Annalise Saxenian wrote her book about regional advantage and sort of Silicon Valley 128 in 1994. So not even less long ago than I thought, right? And then we would have been sitting around lamenting the fact that we were dismal compared to Silicon Valley. And we still like to lament that fact. I mean, there'll never be a universe, I don't think, in which we would sort of yearn for the sunshine of California and what have you, and that's fine. But I think that there really was a sense that this just wasn't the same. We'd missed the boat, it wasn't going to happen. And a lot of that was put down to sort of a culture of unfriendliness and, oh dear, unfriendly British heritage, not a very nice place, and it rains. And I think that one of the things that happened really quickly after that was the sort of takeoff of the life sciences, and it turned out that either biologists were more friendly than the engineers, or something was happening. But it's taken, I think, quite a long time for us to get to this critical mass. And if we rewound the clock 5 years, this part of Boston just wouldn't be the same. It's well, yeah. Or worse. I mean, every time I come here, there's a new build. It's transformative on a week-by-week basis, I think. And I think now it's Somerville and sort of the artisans, the silent, right, whatever it is, right? And so I think that it's both really slow and really fast all at the same time in a way that's a little bit perplexing. And I do think that cultures change. I don't think they're as durable because we can create new social sort of fabrics. And I think we have to be patient, but I also think we have to think about what we're good at. So there was a moment in time, and I did lots of work in the life sciences, when 49 of the 50 states stated that their policy in innovation was to be a top 5 biotech hub. I mean, that turns out just to be impossible, right? So you know, some number of those, 44, had to be wrong.
Still working.
They're still working on that. And so I think really thinking about what's sort of differentiated, what's special, and investing in your comparative advantage is extraordinarily important. And is that always going to be the thing that is going to drive as fast as social media will ever know? Because I think that it's both extraordinarily slow, and yet there are fast things that are happening all the time. I think that.
I'm going to go back to. Okay. Go back to.
Go back to an earlier question about culture back at the beginning. This is sort of a different direction, but one of the companies that I work with is it's a manufacturing company, and so a lot of engineers, and it's a Fortune 50 type of company. And the statement that comes from that company is, we don't have an innovation problem. We have an entrepreneurship problem. And this is something that I've heard from other engineering-related companies. It's not a question of innovation. It's a question of what do you do with the innovation inside a culture that preserves itself. And so this particular company is working with us, where we have put them in the midst of our innovation district to be able to interact with those little gnats that always kind of bug you and nip at your heels, the people that fail fast, that have great ideas and go 100 miles an hour, and either succeed or they fail. But they want to be in that kind of environment. So they want to take this innovation and put it into that kind of environment and be with other entrepreneurs that are thinking very entrepreneurially. And so basically, this person's critique is, it's not an innovation issue, it's an entrepreneurship issue, and it's a cultural institutional issue. And so he is working to bring, for his corporation, bring the innovation into an entrepreneurial environment. Now, this may be different in an IT situation, but I'm curious as to what your take is on that.
Well, I believe that any large Fortune 50 company, and I think we fall within that at this point in time, that's the only way we're going to survive in the tech industry today, or I think in any industry all up. I mean, it is, we go back, and I hate to harp on this because I mentioned earlier, it's systems theory, is, if you have a closed system, you're going to end up with entropy. And how do you open up a system? It's through innovation. And culturally, I'm a lifer. I've been at Microsoft on and off since the early 90s. I've seen a massive culture shift just in the last year in terms of recognizing that not all good ideas come from within. We need to be open and porous to the community to bring this stuff in. And from your question, it's not clear to me whether the culture, the larger culture you're dealing with is willing to think of it more as an open-closed conversation versus, I'm not quite seeing the distinction between innovation and entrepreneurship that you're making here, but I would almost refer it as an open-closed.
I think the issue was trying to challenge the engineers within the system to take those ideas and commercialize it.
Within the company or outside?
Within the company. And so
well, then you've got an internal culture problem, and that's something, exactly. I mean, yeah. And
that's my question.
Okay, got it.
How does that compare to an IT, a large IT company? Do you have culture problems like that? Do you have innovation, a lot of innovation within the company that you can't, that takes too long to get to market, that takes too long to commercialize?
Well, I've been out of the engineering side of the company for about 5 years. I worked on every version of Windows, starting with NT 3.1 all the way through to Windows 7. So I skipped 8, thank God. That was the problem I left. No, but in all seriousness, you've probably seen the cartoon of here are different IT organizations, and Apple, arrows pointing to Steve Jobs, and the Microsoft one basically had different organizations with guns pointing at each other. The GM model, exactly. And it is something where our new CEO has been really clear that the old model doesn't work. You know, we can't have P&Ls competing against each other in terms of taking on innovation. We need to basically understand that there's a problem we're all collectively trying to solve, and figure out how to allow that type of innovation to flourish at this point in time. It isn't enough for you know, Group A to be working on the same problem as Group B, and then they kill each other off at some point in time. But yeah, we're seeing a shift change.
Well, it strikes me also that there's some inherent problems in doing it within a corporation. The risk of being wrong is approximately the same as if you're doing it outside, but the reward is far less. So the ratio of I'll be my own boss, and if I win billions. And if I lose, I'm out of the job, versus if I win, well, maybe I get promoted and a 25% raise in my salary, and if I lose, I'm out of a job. So it just isn't the same.
Well, I've done a lot of kooky things at Delphi when it was the world's largest automotive supplier. So I was involved in creating companies out of all their IP. And one of my great things was we had in the world headquarters 10 large bays you could drive cars into. And the CEO went above it, and the Chrysler car and the GM, he put all these things on it to show them, and we had a novel software technology. I said, you know what, let's do a garage startup. Why don't you give me that garage because it's empty. So he gave it to me, and I brought in a whole bunch of Delphi engineers to do a startup inside world headquarters of one of these garages. It was very cool. I hired one of these guys as an engineer, and the guy freaked out after a few days because when we started to furnish it very quickly, just like you're doing a startup, he got a desk phone that didn't have a speaker on it. And level 8 engineers get phones with speaker phones on it. And that was a level 7 phone. And honest to God, it was horrible. And it was, there were 100, it was like dying through 100 cuts. But it could be done, and the CEO supported it, and people sort of stepped in line. But that's a culture shift. And make sure you get the right phone. Verizon.
I can help you with that. I'd say we've tried it a couple of different ways. We have worked with new, exciting innovations that we've either acquired or partnered with, and kept them very separate because of the cultural issue. I would tell you that has been more the past practice, and now the current practice is to get people on board to change and be more entrepreneurial, to bring the right people in to help support that, because we've got some great people that maybe aren't accustomed to that way of thinking and living, as you say, not worrying about whether you have a cubicle or you have an office with glass or half glass or a door kind of thing. But I'd say we're getting better at it, but we've got a long way to go.
I would just say that, so this is a perennial problem, right? There've been, I don't know how many books that people have written on the subject, and I think that everything that organizations do to become highly coordinated and efficient mitigates against their ability to be independently minded and entrepreneurial risk-taking. And so I think that, you basically see organizations shift backwards and forwards along some frontier, and you hope the frontier's like that. I think it's probably like this, right? So, where you basically sort of shift along that frontier and say, oh, let me be more coordinated. Oh, I've lost the entrepreneurial spirit, so now let me be less coordinated. Oh, I'm not so efficient and organized, and they just move backwards and forwards. And I think, right. And so I think a few organizations, a part, I think, of why the whole notion of an innovation ecosystem strategy is so appealing is the idea that you might be able to break out of that by kind of being embedded in these very different kinds of places. But it still begs the question of, at what point do you bring this stuff in, which then brings us back to Liz's question about scaling. At what moment do you very kindly allow your small entrepreneurial startup partners to have the full benefit of your HR, legal, kind of financial and accounting teams to quote unquote help them, right? And I think that's always the really big challenge. And some companies have got much better at doing that, I think. Carlos, you're in charge of timing.
Do I read the moderator?
Do we have time for another question?
If you would allow, yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, Lori Zapalak from MIT. I'm wondering, especially given that this topic today is innovation in the city, it's also innovation and the state, and it's innovation in the region, this whole need to think at multiple scales simultaneously. In light also of thinking of where we've been since Annalee Saxony and Road Regional Advantage, have you really crafted an effective narrative about what's taking place in Cambridge, what's taking place in Boston, what's taking place in the Route 128 corridor today, and even in our gateway cities in Massachusetts? Because to me, this whole idea that place-based innovation is not just in one place, in one district, it really can be everywhere, and that if we start to work across these scales, we can cross-pollinate even better. Thoughts? And also, I want to say that Donna and Cathy, I've seen you twice in the last week, so I affirm the fact that you all are all over the place and contributing to dialogue, so thank you.
I think we're on our way. We have a lot of work to do, but I think we have a lot of willingness. I do think that the universities, the community colleges, the educational institutions play a huge role in whatever the geography they're in to help bring us all together and work with us. I think there has to be some convening of place and space, and quite honestly, they seem to be the trigger in so many ways. It's easy here, but UMass, their system is quite rich. If you look at what's going on in University of Massachusetts out in Amherst, in Lowell, now in Dartmouth, that's really, I think, exciting. And you know, I think you saw us at the gubernatorial forum, right? And we are, as a community, trying to spur thinking on the part of future government leaders for the state. You know, Governor Patrick did a great job. Whether you agree with every one of his policies really isn't the case, but for, you know, spurring of the economy and innovation, life sciences, technology, really we are on our way. The key will be to make sure that that work gets enhanced. And I think that's where the role of business along with education and government working together. And when I say business, I'm not just talking about Microsoft and Verizon, but reaching out to those colonies of entrepreneurs, startups, small business, and medium-sized business in some of those gateway cities that you talked about in different parts of the state and bringing those folks together.
One of the unsung sets of people or organizations in this space is the quasi-state agencies. I think about Mass Tech, Mass Bio, Mass CEC. Speaking as someone who, you know, was in a net new role, who had to figure out where could we put basically two bodies. It's Amy Sprung and myself who manage Boston, the city, as well as Boston, the state capital. They have been instrumental in helping us figure out what matters and how we could scale. We've talked a lot about scale of business and scale of startups. There's also a scale of resources. People come to us and say, you're an $80 billion company. Why don't you have more resources to do this type of work? It's like, well, we've been asked to run like a startup, you know, fail fast, innovate, lean and mean. So we've given a small budget, the two of us, to do this. And I think those quasi-state public agencies have helped us really prioritize to these people that you talk about.
I think one way the large corporations are helping in the diffusion outside Massachusetts, outside Boston and Cambridge, is the incredible increase in the price of real estate are making such towns as Woburn, suddenly where they're all moving to. So because people can afford, the startups can afford to rent the place. Oh, where's Tim? He needs to do a satellite out in Woburn. But anyway. But it is spreading. So rather than trying to recolonize way far, just keep spreading.
I would just use that, I think, as a way of perhaps closing and plugging the next speaker, if I may suggest, right? Which we have, don't we have Ed Glazer?
We do have it later at 6 p.m.
At 6 p.m.
So we plan to have an hour of
That's
cookies
right.
and coffee and socializing. And so it comes at 6 for Q&A session.
And I think what's interesting about Edward is he's written a lot about the rise of the city, right, at a time, I think, and he started thinking about that when really America was a place that had gone from the city to the suburbs. And I think what's interesting about this is it tells us something about the scale at which these innovation systems are really operating. And I think there's something about the city scale. I mean, the work that I've done, and my little group I work with, a bunch of us thinking around this, and many of you are in this room, is that there's something about the sort of 5 million people thing that just seems to, there's enough scale and critical mass, you get these pockets of activity, but it is tricky, and you get districts, cities, collections of towns, states, New England, and I think that for us in Boston, that's why the governor has this important role, because you can think beyond a specific city. I think in larger cities like New York, that's why the job of the mayor has become increasingly interesting, and why you see mayors sort of having a more powerful voice is because innovation often happens at the sort of scale of these larger cities. And so I think it's a very, there are sort of fractals and small pockets, but I do think there's something about the scale, and I believe that that's why Ed's work is so thoughtful on this subject. So I'm going to leave it at that as a plug for my colleague up the river.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.